The day my former boss walked into my boardroom, he was already talking. That was always how he entered rooms, mid-sentence with whoever was beside him, filling the space before anyone else could. He had flown in from Chicago expecting to negotiate with the founder of Meridian Capital Group. He had researched the firm. He had prepared talking points and a financial summary and a quiet kind of confidence about how the meeting would go. He had not prepared for me. I watched him from the head of the conference table as he crossed the room and found his seat. I watched the exact moment his eyes landed on the nameplate in front of me, the one I had placed there myself, the one that read, Founder and CEO, Meridian Capital Group. And I watched 11 years collapse into about 4 seconds on his face. The color left him the way heat leaves a room when someone opens a window in January. Fast and total and irreversible. I didn't smile. I didn't need to. I just said, "Please, sit down. I think we have quite a bit to discuss." But to understand what that moment was, you have to go back to the morning that made it necessary. I was 24 years old when I started at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions in downtown Chicago. I had worked for that job the way some people work for things they know will define them, completely, almost recklessly. I graduated in the top 5% of my class at the University of Illinois, spent 3 sleepless nights rebuilding their case study from scratch when I thought my first attempt wasn't strong enough, and sent handwritten thank you cards to every single person on the hiring panel after my final interview. My mother said I was overdoing it. My father said the marketing industry was not a stable long-term career for someone with my supposed potential. But I had the job, and I had my fiancé, Daniel, and I had a plan that felt solid as pavement under my feet. My boss ran the creative strategy division. He was the kind of man who wore expensive suits and spoke in measured tones and made everyone in every room feel like they were operating just slightly below his altitude. In my first year, I thought it was brilliance. I genuinely did. I studied how he moved through presentations, how he read client energy, how he could redirect a conversation without anyone noticing he'd done it. I wanted to learn everything he knew. I stayed late. I came in early. I said yes to every assignment he handed me, no matter how much work it added to my week. The second year, I started to notice the pattern. He would give me a project, full campaign strategy, market research, consumer behavior analysis, creative direction, and ask for it by Friday. I'd deliver it by Thursday, always. He would spend the weekend reviewing it, make small adjustments, change the header slide to his name, and present it Monday morning as the product of his leadership and vision. My name would appear, if it appeared at all, in a list of people who had contributed to the preparation. I told myself this was how it worked at the junior level, that you paid your dues and eventually things shifted. I told myself that right up until the Hartfield account. Hartfield was a national retail chain, $15 million in annual billing if we won the pitch. My boss put me on point for the entire creative strategy and told me he would polish it up before the client presentation. I gave that project 6 weeks of my life. I conducted consumer research, ran focus groups, mapped seasonal purchase behavior across 7 regions, and built a campaign framework around an insight that I had spent 3 weeks trying to prove and then prove again. I believed in that work the way you believe in something you've tested from every angle and it keeps holding. We won the account. At the celebration dinner, my boss gave a speech about creative vision and the kind of leadership that could see around corners. My name appeared once, near the end, grouped with 2 other junior employees, as someone who had helped with the preparation process. I sat at that table and kept my expression pleasant and told myself to be patient. But something had changed in me that night, quietly, like a lock turning. 3 weeks later, a colleague I trusted told me, carefully, that the strategy documents my boss had presented to the senior executive team had only his name on them, not mine. Not anyone else's, just his. I went to him privately. I chose my words carefully. I told him I wasn't looking for conflict. I simply wanted to understand how authorship was being tracked for future projects, because I planned to be at the company for a long time, and I wanted to make sure I was building the right record. He looked at me the way powerful people look at smaller threats, not alarmed, just calculating. Then he said, very calmly, "I think you might want to reconsider your position here." I didn't understand what he meant until 3 days later when he called a division meeting. I remember the blazer I wore that morning. Blue. Structured. I had bought it specifically because my mother had told me once, offhandedly, that I dressed too casually for someone who wanted to be taken seriously. 43 people were in that conference room. My boss stood at the front and announced, in the measured tone I had once admired, that he had become aware of a serious breach of professional ethics. He said that an employee had been attempting to claim sole credit for work that was produced through team collaboration and leadership. He said that kind of dishonesty had no place in the culture he was building. He was looking directly at me the entire time. I stood up. My voice came out steadier than anything I felt in my body. I said, "That is not what happened. He told me to collect my belongings. He told me HR would follow up. He told me that if I chose to escalate the matter, he was fully prepared to involve legal counsel and that I should think carefully about whether I wanted that on my record." I carried a cardboard box through a lobby full of people I had worked alongside for 2 years. I pushed through the revolving door onto Michigan Avenue and stood on the sidewalk in November cold, with everything I owned from that office balanced in front of me. And I felt something I hadn't felt since I was a child. The specific humiliation of being made small in front of people you wanted to impress. My father called that evening. He and my boss had gone to the same college, had overlapped in professional circles for years. My father did not ask me what had happened. He told me. He said my boss was a man of integrity and long reputation, that whatever had occurred, I had clearly mishandled the situation, and that the appropriate response was to call him and apologize before this went any further. My mother took the phone and said that she had always worried I was too focused on being recognized. That ambition without patience was something young women in particular needed to be careful about. I held the phone for a long time after they hung up. Daniel came over that night. I had been with him for 2 years. I thought he was coming to be beside me. He sat on the edge of my couch in his coat, like a man who had already decided not to stay, and told me that this was a lot to absorb, that he needed some space to think about whether our plans made sense given where things stood with my career. I looked at him across that apartment and tried to find the person I thought I knew in his face. He left around 9. He didn't call the next day or the day after. A week later, I received a short text that used the word timing twice. I spent 3 weeks applying to every firm in Chicago. My former boss had made calls. I couldn't prove exactly what he'd said, but I could feel the result of it in the quality of the silences on the other end of phone screens, in the way one contact I had respected told me over coffee, carefully, that my name had come up in a context she'd rather not repeat. I applied anyway, relentlessly, because giving up felt like agreeing that what he had said about me was true, and I was not willing to agree with that. In the middle of week 4, sitting at my kitchen table at midnight with 15 rejection emails in my inbox and a lease renewal coming due, I found a Craigslist listing for a small consulting firm on the North Side. They needed someone with brand strategy experience who could handle client presentations and worked without a lot of hand-holding. The pay was just enough to cover rent if I stretched carefully. I sent my resume expecting nothing. The woman who called me back the next morning was named Margaret. She was in her early 60s, with gray hair she kept in a practical bun and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She had run her boutique consultancy for 21 years, working with small and mid-sized regional businesses that the big downtown firms considered too small to bother with. She had built it by herself, starting at 40, after spending 12 years at a large agency where a managing partner had presented 3 of her campaigns as his own and been promoted on the back of them. She already knew the story before I told her mine. She hired me in a single afternoon. No speech, no promises, no extended deliberation. She handed me a client folder, pointed to a chair, and said, "Tell me what you see in this." I looked through it for 10 minutes and told her what I saw. She nodded twice, which I would come to understand was her highest form of approval. Then she said, "Be here Monday, 8 o'clock. I don't accommodate late." Working for Margaret was not easy. I want to be precise about that. She was exacting and unsentimental, and she had no patience for work that was merely adequate. She had spent 20 years developing a standard for herself, and she applied it to everyone who worked under her with complete consistency. She made my former boss's demands look relaxed by comparison. But here is what was different. Every piece of work at Margaret's firm belonged entirely to the person who produced it. When I wrote a strategy document, my name was on it. When a client called to say the campaign had worked, Margaret handed me the phone directly. She said once, almost in passing, the way she said most important things, as if they were simply obvious. The only thing worth building is your own name. Everything else is just borrowed real estate. I stayed with her for 3 years. I learned how a real business worked. Not the performance of competence, but the actual architecture of it. I watched her turn away clients she didn't believe in, and hold on to clients who were sometimes late on invoices because she believed in what they were building and understood that good work and good timing don't always coincide. I watched her make difficult calls with a settled certainty I wanted for myself more than I'd wanted almost anything. Near the end of my 3rd year, she called me into her office on a Friday afternoon and said, "You've been ready to go for about a year. I've been waiting to see if you'd figure that out on your own." She folded her hands on her desk. "I think we both know what you're supposed to be doing. It's not working for me." I gave notice the following week. She smiled and said, "Took you long enough." I started Meridian Capital Group in Nashville with $11,000 in savings, a 1-bedroom apartment, and one client, a regional grocery chain that Margaret introduced me to with a phone call I hadn't asked her to make and will never stop being grateful for. I worked every hour that year that wasn't taken up by sleeping or eating, and sometimes those two. I slept on a futon that the previous tenant had left. I drove a car with a cracked windshield for 8 months. I ate a lot of peanut butter on a lot of quiet evenings, and I didn't mind it because the work, when it was going well, produced a feeling I hadn't had since I walked out of that building with a cardboard box. The feeling of making something that was entirely mine. The grocery chain's campaign outperformed their previous year's results by 31% in the first quarter. They referred me to 2 other clients before the year was out. I hired my first employee in year 2. A recent graduate named Priya, who had sent me a cold email so precisely calibrated, so clear about what she understood about the work and what she wanted to learn, that I called her the same afternoon. She is still with me. She runs our whole client integration team now. By year 4, Meridian was a functioning firm. By year 7, we had 2 offices and a reputation that had traveled further than I had pushed it. By year 10, a business journal ran a profile on mid-sized consultancies disrupting the legacy marketing model, and Meridian was the lead example. I remember reading it at my desk and thinking about the kitchen table in that Chicago apartment and the midnight inbox full of rejections, and thinking, simply, okay. My parents reached out twice in those 11 years. Once when my father had a cardiac scare and my mother sent an email, brief and factual, that said it would mean something to hear from me. Once when a cousin's wedding invitation arrived late, clearly an afterthought. I responded to both, briefly and without coldness, because I had decided a long time ago that I was not going to carry bitterness around like something I was still owed. But I hadn't rebuilt the relationship either. Some distances, when they extend long enough, become a kind of geography. You know the other place exists, you just no longer live there, and the maps between you have grown unfamiliar. I didn't hear from Daniel. I thought about my former boss the way you think about old weather once you're indoors, with mild acknowledgement and no personal stake. I heard through the industry that he was still at Pinnacle. I heard, more recently, that Pinnacle had been struggling, losing ground to competitors who moved faster and charged less and didn't carry the overhead of a large downtown office. I stored the information the way you store facts that don't require a response. Which is why, when a corporate broker I knew peripherally called me on a Tuesday morning to say that Pinnacle Marketing Solutions was exploring acquisition options and had identified Meridian as a potential strategic buyer, I sat at my desk without speaking for a moment that was slightly longer than usual. "Do they know who I am?" I asked. A brief pause. The inquiry came through the brokerage channel. They know they're approaching Meridian. I can't say whether they know the founder is you specifically. I thought about 312 people who had built careers at a company that was not responsible for what happened in a conference room 11 years ago. I thought about Margaret, who had died the previous spring after a short illness, who had spent 20 years building something honest in a field that didn't always reward honesty, and who had told me, practically and without drama, that the only thing worth building was your own name. Set the meeting, I said. I arrived early, as I always do. The room was prepared the way every room at Meridian is prepared. Water, printed briefing materials, a quietness that comes from people who do their work carefully. I was already seated at the head of the conference table when my assistant showed the Pinnacle team in. There were 4 of them, a financial advisor, a junior attorney with a leather portfolio, a woman from their executive team I didn't recognize, and my former boss. He came in the way he always entered rooms, talking, already orienting the space around himself. Then his eyes found the nameplate. I watched the processing happen in real time. The conversation he'd been having stopped mid-word. He moved through confusion, then recognition, and then arrived somewhere I can only describe as a man suddenly understanding that the room he thought he was walking into had entirely different walls than he expected. I gave him a moment, not cruelty, just space for the understanding to settle completely. Then I said, "Please, sit down. I think we have quite a bit to discuss." The meeting ran 2 hours. For the first 40 minutes he managed himself the way he always had, measured, controlled, directing traffic. I let him. I asked questions at careful intervals and I watched the rest of his team begin to reread the room. By the halfway point, his financial advisor was addressing all remarks directly to me. His attorney was taking notes on my responses with the attentiveness of someone who has understood, belatedly, whose signatures are going to matter. He avoided my title for the first hour. Then one of his colleagues, citing a page from their materials, used my name and my position in the same sentence, and after that he used them too. Carefully, with a formality I had never once heard from him before. At the end of the meeting, before the team filed out, he asked if we could have a moment privately. The room emptied. We sat across from each other at the long table and it was very quiet. He said, "I owe you an acknowledgement." I didn't ease it for him. I didn't offer the soft phrases that would have made that moment less uncomfortable, the words that would have told him we could both agree to call it nothing. I let the acknowledgement stand in the room on its own. After a moment he said, "What you built here is real. I didn't think you had this in you when you left. I want to be honest about that, since we're sitting here." I looked at him without hostility because I didn't have any. What I had instead was something that had taken 11 years to build alongside everything else. A clarity that had replaced the anger a long time ago, quietly and permanently. "I know," I said. "Most people who saw me leave that day didn't." He nodded. There was nothing left in his expression of the man who had run those rooms. What was there instead was just a person who had reached the end of a story he'd been telling himself for a long time and found it wasn't the story he thought it was. I told him I would bring the acquisition proposal to my board and that my decisions would be made based on what was best for his 312 employees, not on personal history. I told him that any transition structure would not include him in a leadership role at Meridian. I said it clearly without softening it. He said he understood. I think he did. We closed the deal 5 months later. 309 people came over in the transition. I built the integration team myself, with Priya leading it because I knew that how people are brought into something new determines whether they stay. Every employee was briefed personally. Every team was introduced to the Meridian standard the same way Margaret had introduced me to hers. Here is the work. Here is what it requires. Here is what you will have in return. Priya still sends me a text every year on the anniversary of her hire date. It just says, "Still here." It makes me smile every single time. The week the deal closed, I called my mother. Not because of the acquisition. Or not only. Margaret had been on my mind since the spring. The particular quality of her absence, the way she had never once mentioned the man who had taken her campaigns from her. Not in 20 years of running her own shop. Not once. I had been thinking about what that kind of quiet took to build and sustain. My mother answered on the third ring. I told her I was well. I told her, in general terms, what the past 11 years had been. She was quiet for longer than I expected, and when she spoke, she said 4 words. I should have listened. That was it. Not a full accounting. Not the conversation I might have needed at 24, but I was 35, and I had learned by then, from watching clients find out who they actually were through honest work, that people give you what they are genuinely capable of giving, and that accepting that gracefully is a different thing entirely from agreeing that it was enough. I told her I would like to have dinner sometime. She said she would like that. I drove home that evening through Nashville in the early dark of a November Thursday, the city lights spreading east and west in the rear view. And I thought about Margaret's practical shoes and her reading glasses on their chain and the way she had handed me a client folder and said, "Tell me what you see," as though she already knew I'd see the right things. I thought about the futon in the Nashville apartment and the cracked windshield and Praya's cold email and the $11,000 that had been, for a while, everything I had in the world. I thought about 43 people watching me walk out of a conference room with a cardboard box, and I thought about 312 people who had no idea, until they were told, that the company they were joining belonged to the woman in the blue blazer who had left Chicago on a November afternoon with nothing but her own name. I had been told that name wasn't worth much, once, by a man who needed me to believe that so that he could keep taking what I made. Margaret told me it was the only thing worth building. I know which one of them was right. I have known for a long time. I still have that blue blazer. It is in the back of a closet in my house. I don't wear it, and I don't throw it away. I've thought about why I keep it, and I think it's this. It isn't a trophy, and it isn't a wound. It's just a reminder that the worst morning of your life is sometimes only the first morning of your life is sometimes only the first morning of something else entirely. Something that was yours the whole time. You just had to go far enough to find it.